Welcome back to the Fighting Saints Report, the final Fighting Saints Report of 2019, and I'm going to be one of those people that says the final Fighting Saints Report of the decade, even though it's only a couple days. But yes, the final Fighting Saints Report of 2019, and before the break, we teased it. We're doing the top 5 players of the last 10 years in the NHL, but a little bit of a twist because 1 and 2 are going to be consensus for everyone. It's Sidney Crosby, it's Alex Ovechkin. They were pegged as this generation's talent right when they came into the league. They've delivered in spades and then some. I think you're going to get, at least in my opinion, it's Crosby 1, Ovechkin 2, but it's 1-2 regardless of how you slice it for those two players.
They're both older players, but they're still dominant players. I mean, they're all-time greats, no question about it.
Yeah, and I mean, they came into the league before the lockout year, and they've still been producing as the top 2 players in the league for 15 years now. It's pretty incredible, as you mentioned. So we're going to do the top 5 players of the decade, taking out Ovechkin and Crosby, just because that would ruin a little bit of what could be interesting for 1 and 2. So those 2 players are out of the conversation. It's the next best after Ovechkin and Crosby. Before we get to our top 5 players of the decade, any New Year's resolutions that have popped into your head yet?
Not yet. I've been kind of working on some the last month or so, preparing for New Year's. I want to make sure my diet is a little bit better than it has been. It was good for most of the year, but then you get around the holidays, and man, those goodies look good.
Couple extra pounds so you can hibernate through January and February.
Yeah, a little more time on the exercise bike, a little more time on the treadmill maybe, but I've kind of gotten a start on them now to burn off all those goodies that I've been cheating on.
See, I'm not a believer in New Year's resolutions. No. I think it's a cop-out because I think if you choose to start something purposely for a New Year's resolution, you're not 100% committed to it. If it's coming your mind before, you should just start it right away. So
true. That's a good point.
I try not to do New Year's resolutions other than the sense that it's something that I've either just thought of that day or I've started practicing well before, but always interesting to see what resolutions people come up with, and I'm always more interested to see how long they usually last, because when I was
pretty good last year, though. I was pretty good last year.
When I used to make New Year's resolutions, it would last for about a week, and then I would be done with it. So that's part of the reason why I've just done away with making them completely. But we'll get into our top 5. We'll go 5 to 1. Another tidbit on this list, it can be any position. It's obviously tough to rank the difference between a forward and a defenseman, forward, goalie, but we're just going to give the top 5 players of the decade, regardless of position, just how we feel that they've performed, going from 5 to 1. Why don't you kick things off here, Jim?
I'm going to go with a little bit of a sleeper on this one. I'm going to go with Henrik Lundqvist, goaltender for the New York Rangers. He's a .922 career save percentage. I think a lot of people kind of sleep on him because he never had a lot of Stanley Cup success, but he played in front of a team that was really defensively not the greatest over the last decade, and I think if you have a Game 7 in a playoff series, I don't know if there's another goaltender from the decade that I would have rather had than Henrik Lundqvist. Again, I think the defense in front of him was flawed, but he was outstanding, so I want to have a little bit of a blend of defensemen and goaltenders and forwards in my list, so I'm going to go with him. And he would be higher if he had more Stanley Cup success, but you can't really blame him for the team in front of him.
He's not really a sleeper because he's 5 on my list as well. I think he was the best goalie of the decade when you take into account exactly the team in front of him. Corey Crawford had 3 cups. Jonathan Quick had 2 cups. They also had much better teams in front of them than Henrik Lundqvist. If you throw Henrik Lundqvist on those teams, he's going to have at least the same amount of cups. There's no way in my mind that Quick or Crawford is a better goalie than Lundqvist just because of the cups. The biggest goalie debate I had in my mind, take Carey Price out of it too because he was injured a little bit too much, and I believe Carey Price is incredibly overrated to say the least. His numbers are good, but there's no way he's generational goalie good in my opinion. The goalies I was bad at was Marc-Andre Fleury, it was Pekka Rinne, and it was Henrik Lundqvist as the best 3 in this decade, I believe. And I think Lundqvist edges them because, like you said, in the playoffs, in Game 7s, he is one of the best statistical goalies in the history of the game. He carried the New York Rangers to a lot of those conference finals. The defense in the Tortorella era was pretty solid, but they had no offense. So Lundqvist had to win a bunch of 2-1 games, and his stats would be so much better and so much more comparable to the top 5 if he hadn't played on a team that was rebuilding the last 3 years. His goals against and his save percentage has really dipped. He won a Vezina. He's top 10 in playoff goals against and save percentage. He's first in playoff games played. He's first in overall games played in the last decade. He's third in wins in that time as well. To me, he's if he wins the Cup, and I don't know how likely that is now the way the Rangers are going, but he goes down as one of the greatest goalies in history already. He's the Dan Marino of hockey without that Cup, unfortunately. But yeah, Lundqvist is number 5 for me.
At number 4, I wanted to put a defenseman, and this was probably the toughest spot for me. Zdeno Chara from Boston's been unbelievable. He's 100 years old, and he's still playing at a super high level. Duncan Keith, 2 Norris trophies, a couple of Stanley Cups. But at number 4, I'm going to go with Erik Karlsson, the defenseman for San Jose. The thing that really jumped out at me was in 2017 when he was with Ottawa, he had an unbelievable playoff series. His team didn't even make it to the Stanley Cup playoffs, but he got Conn Smythe Trophy votes, which is the playoff MVP. He got playoff MVP votes. He didn't even make it to the Stanley Cup final. It says all you need to know about him. He had just a shade under a point per game, about 0.83 points per game during the decade. 4 All-Star games, a couple Norris trophies as the top defenseman in the league. So I wanted to put a defenseman on that list, and he's the guy that I went with.
I wanted to put a defenseman on the list. I did as well. I thought about Karlsson for a long time. I really did. But to me, he's, at least earlier in the decade, the defensive game just he wasn't as complete of a player. If he was as good defensively as he is now, the thing with Karlsson is he had a finite window where I thought he was elite offensively and elite defensively. Now he's almost lost the step with a little bit of injuries, so he's not as good offensively. He's still fantastic. I didn't go with Keith either. I didn't go with Chara either. I went with Drew Doughty. I think Drew Doughty's been the best defenseman of this decade. And likewise with Lundqvist, where the last couple years Lundqvist hasn't been as good because the team around him hasn't been as good. It's the same thing for Doughty. But when the Kings were in their prime from 2010 to 2015-16, Doughty was as good as it gets. I think he should have more than 1 Norris Trophy. I think he was at least a 2-time Norris Trophy winner in my mind. He had the most time on ice of the decade in both the playoffs and the regular season. He's a workhorse who never quit, and I mean his motor's unbelievable. 406 points, which is just outside the top 10 in defense, but I tend to lean more to a good defensive defenseman that can also put up points, and I thought Doughty, he's right up there with Keith in terms of the time on ice, and I think he's a little bit better in terms of a puck mover and a player overall, and 2 cups as well. I mean, you can't argue with that type of hardware. So I got Drew Doughty and that toothless grin at number 4 on my list.
Going up to number 3, I'm going to go with Steven Stamkos from the Tampa Bay Lightning. Scored 370 goals during the decade, which was the most by a center in the 2010s. And he averaged more than a point per game during the decade as well. And he scored 370 goals as a center. The next best with John Tavares with 312. So that's quite a big difference between the number 1 goal scoring center and the number 2. And he's always seemed like always a money goal scorer. Had some injuries, had a severe, nasty broken leg that really sidelined him. Otherwise, I think he could have done a lot better than 370. Probably pushing 400 if he wouldn't have been injured so much. But he's at my number 3. Steven Stamkos.
Number 3, I'm going to go with a player where the points aren't as sexy as everyone else, but for my money, he's the best 2-way center in the game still, Patrice Bergeron. He's a 4-time Selke winner in the decade. The Selke is given to the best defensive forward. He's never been outside the top 5 in Selke voting the entire decade. I mean, that shows you how good he is every single year. He has a little trouble with injury, but not enough to keep him out of the lineup for more than 10 to 15 games a season. And he's now the centerpiece of the top line in hockey between him, Marchand, and Pastrnak. But I think Bergeron, the leadership, the 4-time Selke winner, is incredible to do that in the decade. And he also won a cup as well, and is a tremendous playoff performer. And his durability, even with those injuries, he plays through so much in the playoffs sometimes. I remember when he played with 3 cracked ribs and a broken leg.
Unbelievable.
I mean, unbelievable toughness from Bergeron. And just, I think people get caught up a lot. The same thing with the Norris Trophy. It's usually now whoever scores the most points from a defenseman. People get caught up in those stats. He's the best two-way center in the game, and better than Crosby as a two-way center, better than Alexander Barkov as a two-way center, and has been for a decade straight, better than Anze Kopitar as a two-way center. So give me Patrice Bergeron at number 3.
How many NHL GMs would take a guy like that if they had to draft over? How many guys would take a guy like that to build your team around?
A lot. Obviously, age, you wouldn't take Bergeron now, but that's the type of player that you absolutely want. Yeah, absolutely. Bergeron, number 3 for me.
I'm going to go at number 2. I'm going to go with Evgeny Malkin of the Pittsburgh Penguins. Had more points per game than any player in the decade. Won the Hart Trophy as the MVP. He won the Art Ross as the points leader. He won the Ted Lindsay as the Players MVP. Won 2 Stanley Cups. The Penguins won the most games of any team in the decade, regular season games of any team in the decade, and I think he just gets overshadowed by Sidney Crosby way too much. But Evgeny Malkin had an outstanding decade, and it's just, I think a lot of people will remember him as more of a sidekick to Crosby than the great player that he is, and he had an outstanding decade.
You know, when I talked to you last night and said, all right, we're doing the top 5, but without Crosby and Ovechkin, I was like, okay, this will make it interesting. And then I realized the top 2 were still pretty obvious, in my opinion at least, and I figured you would have the same thought. Malkin's my number 2 as well. You mentioned all the accolades. The season when Crosby didn't play because of that concussion, Malkin had 50 goals, 59 assists. He won the scoring title. He was MVP, 109 points, and I think that was the season that showed everyone that Evgeny Malkin might be almost as good as Sidney Crosby. I'm not willing to say he's as good as Sidney Crosby, but he is the smallest peg below Crosby, and he's another player that, injuries have been a little bit of a storyline for him, but not enough for him to not be the highest points per game player in the last decade. He's incredible to watch. He glides. He's a big guy, but he skates incredibly well. And he's easily a top 100 player in the history of the game, and it's incredible that the Penguins have gotten 2 generational talents on the same team for as long as they have, a big reason why they've won 3 cups in the last 12 years.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Crosby is a little bit better defensively than Malkin, and that's maybe that's what separates him from Malkin. My number 1 player, I'm going to go with Patrick Kane, the Chicago Blackhawks. He's the only American player to win the Hart Trophy as the league MVP. Won 3 Stanley Cups. He won a Conn Smythe as a playoff MVP. He won the Art Ross as a points leader in the NHL. Won the Ted Lindsay as the Players MVP, and he had the most points per game in the 2010s. You can say what you want about his character off the ice, which I think he's gotten a lot better. I think he's matured a lot during the last decade, but and still he's another player who's played the entire decade. He's gotten he's an older player now. He's in his 30s, and he still produces at a super high level. I think he might go down as the greatest American hockey player of all time. Chris Chelios is right in there. He's for my money, he's the best American-born player ever. But because he played till he was 100, but Patrick Kane could challenge Chelios for that level if he keeps continuing to produce the way he has.
755 points in the decade. That's more than anyone else had in hockey. I saw a couple lists that did the top 10 players of the decade, and some of them didn't have Patrick Kane on them, which is just absolutely criminal. Yeah, he is the best American player this decade. Top 3 easy all time, and you can definitely make a case for number 1. And somehow, for at least part of the decade, he was overshadowed by a player that's nowhere close to his skill level in Jonathan Toews. Mm-hmm. I still think this is going to be a Jonathan Toews rant now. He's one of the most overrated players in the history of hockey. I know you're a Blackhawks fan, but it's just Patrick Kane is so much more a reason why those teams won the cup in my mind than Jonathan Toews. I think Toews is still a great player, but somehow he got a lot more credit than Patrick Kane gets. The only other player that was probably more underrated in this decade than Patrick Kane was Claude Giroux. He was top 5 in points with a Flyers team that didn't have nearly the weapons of the Blackhawks. But yeah, Patty Kane, to me, a clear number 1 behind Sidney Crosby and Alex Ovechkin as the best player in this decade. He was so dominant. He played on so many good teams. Those 3 cups that you mentioned, and just about every individual accolade that you can win as a forward. They call him Showtime, and he put on a pretty good show for the last decade. And he's another player where next 3 or 4 years, I think he's still going to be producing. He's not going to be putting up 100 points, but he's going to be producing 60, 70, 80 points for this Blackhawks team that's in a rebuild. He's a lot of fun to watch. And certainly deserving of number 1 on our list.
Do you want to go out on a limb and say who's going to be your player of the decade for the 2020s?
If I had to flip a coin, heads would be McDavid, tails would be McDavid.
Yeah, and I hesitated. I wanted to find it. If we were doing the top 10, I think I would have had McDavid in there. He only played 4 years in the decade. He's only 23 years old, but he's probably he's the most dynamic player in the NHL right now, and just didn't play enough games in the decade to make that team. But boy, as of right now, there's not a player. It bounced back from injury the way he has.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna go out on a limb and say he's gonna be the player. 10 years from now, hopefully 10 years, you're not still here. But 10 years from now, I think if we have this conversation, I think it's going to be Connor McDavid as that number 1 spot.
Yeah, McDavid seems like the early front runner for a couple days from now to kick off the new decade. Well, that's all the time we have for this edition of the Fighting Saints Report. Dubuque and Waterloo twice this weekend, and then we'll talk to you next Monday, same time, same place here on Super Hits 106.